They sold her house while she was fighting to stay alive in the ICU. And by the time Margaret Doyle woke up, everything she had built over 50 years was gone, signed away by the very son she raised. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to check, was that her late mother had left her something far more powerful than a house, something buried, forgotten, and waiting for the exact moment her life would be torn apart. Margaret Doyle was 78 years old when her heart gave out on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The kind of morning that never feels like it could be your last in a place you've lived for half a century. Standing in the same kitchen where she had packed school lunches, argued over curfews, and once danced barefoot with her husband to an old radio, playing softly in the background. And the last thing she remembered before collapsing was the sound of running water and a cup slipping from her hand, shattering against the tile as her body followed, her breath catching in a way that felt unfamiliar and final. The ambulance came quickly, neighbors watching from their porches, whispering with concern, because Margaret was known in that quiet suburban street, not as someone fragile, but as someone steady, someone who had survived loss before when her husband passed nearly a decade ago, someone who never asked for help and never seemed to need it, until now. By the time she reached the hospital, her condition had worsened, doctors moving fast, voices low but urgent, and within hours she was in the ICU, unconscious, connected to machines that breathed and monitored and sustained what her body could no longer manage alone, while her two sons, Daniel and Craig, were called in. They arrived separately, both dressed neatly, both wearing expressions that could easily be mistaken for worry, but beneath that surface was something colder, something quieter, something that had been building long before that phone call. They stood at her bedside, not speaking much to her, because she couldn't hear them anyway, but speaking plenty to each other in hushed tones just outside the room, asking questions not just about her condition, but about timelines, probabilities, outcomes, the kinds of conversations that didn't sound like grief, but like preparation. And in the days that followed, as Margaret remained unconscious, those conversations shifted from uncertainty to decision, because both sons came to the same conclusion without ever needing to say it directly. Even if she survived, she wouldn't come back the same, and even if she did, she couldn't live alone anymore. And if she couldn't live alone, then the house that had quietly increased in value over the years, sitting on a large plot in a now desirable neighborhood, would become a burden, an asset waiting to be managed, or more accurately, liquidated. So they didn't wait. They told themselves it was practical, responsible, necessary. They told themselves they were avoiding complications later. But what they were really doing was acting before she had the chance to object. Within a week, they had contacted a real estate agent. Within 10 days, the house was listed. They moved through her belongings with efficiency that bordered on indifference, sorting decades of her life into piles. Keep, sell, donate, discard, without ever pausing long enough to consider what those items meant beyond their surface value. Old photo albums boxed without being opened, letters tucked away without being read, her late husband's belongings reduced to items of minimal resale value. The neighbors noticed the activity, the unfamiliar cars, the hurried pace, and when they asked questions, the sons gave simple answers. It's what's best for her. She won't be coming back here. We're taking care of things. And because no one wants to challenge a story that sounds responsible on the surface, they accepted it. The house sold quickly. Too quickly. A cash buyer. Clean paperwork. No delays. By the time Margaret's condition stabilized, by the time her breathing no longer depended entirely on machines, by the time her body began the slow, painful process of returning to consciousness, the deal was already closed. The keys had changed hands. The money had been transferred. The life she had built in that home had been erased with signatures she never gave. When she finally opened her eyes, it wasn't dramatic. No sudden gasp, no cinematic clarity. Just a slow awareness returning, a dull ache in her chest, the sterile smell of the hospital filling her senses as she blinked against the light, trying to piece together where she was and why. A nurse noticed first, then called for the doctor, then for her sons, who arrived later that day, stepping into the room with carefully arranged expressions of relief, as if they had been waiting endlessly for this moment, as if their actions hadn't already assumed it might never come. Margaret's voice was weak when she first spoke, barely more than a whisper, but her mind, though foggy, was already searching for something familiar, something grounding, and the first clear thought that formed wasn't about her condition or the hospital or even her son standing beside her. It was about home. "Can I go back?" she asked quietly, her eyes moving between them, expecting reassurance, expecting the simple comfort of knowing that whatever had happened, she still had somewhere that was hers. The silence that followed was brief but heavy, and it was Daniel who spoke first, choosing his words with the kind of care that often hides something irreversible. "Mom, there's something we need to tell you." And in that moment, before the explanation even began, Margaret felt it, something slipping, something wrong, something that had already been decided without her. When they told her, they framed it as necessity, as a decision made under pressure, as something done for her benefit. But the words didn't land the way they intended, because beneath the explanation was a truth she couldn't ignore. They hadn't waited for her. They hadn't asked her. They hadn't even believed she would come back to ask. Her home was gone. Sold. Emptied. Final. And as she lay there, still too weak to sit up, still recovering from a body that had nearly given out on her, she realized that the life she thought she was returning to no longer existed. Not because time had taken it, but because her own sons had. Days later, as if to soften the blow, Craig handed her a small envelope they claimed to have found while clearing out the house, something they had almost thrown away, something that didn't seem important at the time. Inside was a key, old, rusted, unfamiliar, and a folded note written in handwriting Margaret hadn't seen in years, her mother's handwriting, careful and steady even in its age. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, her sons watching with mild curiosity, expecting nothing more than sentiment, something irrelevant to what had already been done. But the note was short, direct, and strangely deliberate. "If they ever take everything from you, go here." Beneath it was an address. Margaret stared at it, her heart beating a little faster despite everything her body had just endured, because she recognized it. Not clearly at first, but enough to know it wasn't random. It was a place from long ago, a place her mother had mentioned only a handful of times, always vaguely, always as if it wasn't meant to matter yet. Her sons dismissed it immediately, calling it nothing, probably worthless, probably falling apart, just another relic from a past that had no relevance to her future. But Margaret didn't respond, because as she lay there, holding the one thing they hadn't touched, the one thing they hadn't understood, something inside her, quiet but unmistakable, began to shift. Margaret Doyle wasn't supposed to leave the hospital with a plan. She was supposed to leave with instructions, limitations, and a carefully arranged future her sons had already decided for her. One that involved assisted living, scheduled meals, monitored medication, and a quiet, controlled existence that would keep her safe, predictable, and out of the way. But as she sat by the window of her hospital room in the days following their confession, turning that rusted key over in her fingers and rereading her mother's note until the ink felt etched into her memory, something about the finality of what had been taken from her refused to settle into resignation, because Margaret had lived too long, endured too much, and built too much with her own hands to accept that her story would end in a place chosen by someone else, even if those someone else's were her own sons. They visited regularly in those first days, bringing brochures, talking gently but firmly about what comes next, outlining options as if she had already agreed to them, as if her silence meant consent rather than calculation. But Margaret listened without committing, nodding when necessary, conserving her strength not just physically, but mentally, because she understood something they didn't. This wasn't just about where she would live, it was about whether she would still be allowed to choose anything at all. And the answer to that question came quietly one morning when a nurse asked her what address to list for discharge paperwork. And instead of giving the name of the assisted living facility her sons had selected, Margaret paused, reached for the folded note on her bedside table, and slowly read out the address written in her mother's hand. The coastal town she hadn't visited in decades, the place her sons had already dismissed as irrelevant. The nurse hesitated, surprised, but wrote it down anyway, because Margaret's voice, though soft, carried a certainty that didn't invite argument. When Daniel and Craig found out, they tried to intervene, their concerns suddenly sharper, more urgent, asking questions about practicality, about her health, about how she could possibly manage alone in a place that likely didn't even have proper medical facilities. But Margaret met their objections with the same calm silence she had given their plans, and for the first time since she woke up, they realized they weren't speaking to someone confused or fragile. They were speaking to someone who had already decided. 2 days later, with discharge papers signed and a small suitcase packed with what little she now owned, Margaret Doyle left the hospital not toward the future her sons had arranged, but towards something uncertain, something older, something that belonged to her in a way nothing else did anymore. The journey wasn't easy, her body still weak, her movements slow, every step a reminder of how close she had come to not surviving at all. But there was something about moving forward on her own terms that gave her strength she didn't expect, and by the time she boarded the bus that would take her north, away from the city, away from everything that had been decided for her without her permission, she felt something she hadn't felt since before the ICU. Not control, not yet, but direction. The ride was long, stretching across hours of changing landscapes, from crowded streets to quieter roads, from noise to something closer to silence. And Margaret spent most of it looking out the window, letting memories surface slowly, fragments of a place she had almost forgotten, her mother mentioning the Cannery in passing, never with pride, never with regret, just with a quiet certainty that it would matter someday, though she had never explained how or why. When the bus finally pulled into the small coastal town, it felt smaller than Margaret remembered, as if time had pressed in on it from all sides, leaving behind only what refused to disappear completely: weathered buildings, a handful of open shops, the distant sound of waves breaking against a shoreline that had outlasted everything else. She stepped off carefully, adjusting to the unfamiliar ground, the salt air filling her lungs in a way that felt both sharp and grounding. And for a moment she simply stood there, taking it in, wondering if she had made a mistake, if her sons had been right, if this was nothing more than a desperate attempt to hold on to something that didn't exist anymore. But then she reached into her bag, felt the key again, and started walking. The Cannery wasn't hard to find, not because it stood out, but because it didn't belong anywhere else. Sitting at the edge of the town near the water, large and worn, its exterior marked by years of neglect, paint peeled away, windows cracked or boarded, the structure itself looking like something that had been left behind not by accident, but by choice. Margaret stopped a few steps away, her heart beating a little faster, not from exertion this time, but from something deeper, something tied to the realization that this place, whatever it was now, was hers in a way nothing else was anymore. She didn't expect much when she approached the door, didn't expect it to open easily, didn't expect anything inside to be salvageable, but when she slid the key into the lock and turned it, feeling the resistance give way with a heavy, reluctant click, it was enough to make her pause, because even after all these years, even after everything that had been taken from her, this one thing had remained untouched, waiting. The door creaked open slowly, the sound echoing into the dim interior as Margaret stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the low light, taking in the layers of dust, the rusted machinery, the long-abandoned equipment that once must have filled the space with noise and purpose. And for a moment, it looked exactly like her sons had described: worthless, broken, beyond saving. But Margaret didn't turn back. She walked further in, each step deliberate, her hand brushing lightly against surfaces that still held the shape of what they had once been: conveyor belts, metal tables, crates stacked in corners, all of it silent now, but not empty. Because beneath the decay, beneath the years of neglect, there was still something there: structure, foundation, the kind of strength that doesn't disappear just because it's been ignored. She found a small office space near the front, its door half-hanging, papers scattered across the floor, and pushed it open, setting her bag down as she looked around, trying to imagine what this place had been when her mother last stood here, what she had seen in it that made her keep it, protect it, and eventually pass it on with a note that only made sense now. That first day, Margaret didn't do much. She couldn't. Her body wouldn't allow it. But she did enough: cleared a chair, opened a window, let in fresh air that pushed back against the stale stillness, and sat down, not as someone passing through, but as someone who intended to stay. The following days were slow, measured, each task small but intentional: sweeping one section, clearing another, resting often, listening to her body but not letting it decide everything for her. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the space began to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that it no longer felt entirely abandoned. People noticed. Of course they did. A town that small doesn't miss much, especially not an elderly woman working alone in a place everyone else had written off. And it started with curiosity. A fisherman who stopped by to ask what she was doing, a passerby who lingered a little longer than necessary, a woman from the diner who brought her a cup of coffee and stayed to talk. Margaret didn't offer long explanations. She didn't need to. "I'm fixing it," she would say simply. And while most people didn't quite believe her at first, they didn't dismiss her either, because there was something in the way she said it, something steady, something that suggested this wasn't a passing idea or a desperate distraction, but a decision. And decisions, Margaret knew, were powerful things, especially the ones no one else expected you to make. Margaret Doyle didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. But 3 months after stepping into that abandoned cannery with nothing but a rusted key and a note, she had quietly done exactly that, because the fragile woman her sons had left behind in a hospital bed no longer existed, replaced instead by someone steady, deliberate, and entirely in control of what came next, even if the world hadn't caught up to that reality yet. The cannery wasn't fully restored. Far from it, but it was no longer dead either. One section had been cleared, prepared just enough to function, and with the help of a few locals who had slowly stopped watching and started helping, Margaret had brought part of it back to life. Not as a massive operation, but as something smaller, something real, a place where local fishermen could once again clean, process, and prepare their catch instead of driving miles to towns that barely acknowledged them anymore. And in doing so, she had given the town something it hadn't had in years: momentum. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was there, growing quietly day by day, just like Margaret herself. But the real shift, the moment everything changed, came not from the work she was doing, but from something her mother had left behind, hidden so carefully that even time hadn't managed to erase it. It happened on an ordinary afternoon while Margaret was sorting through an old storage room at the back of the building, a space she hadn't yet fully explored, where rusted cabinets lined the walls and forgotten paperwork sat in damp, curling stacks. And as she moved one of the cabinets slightly to clear the floor beneath it, she noticed something odd. A gap in the wall that didn't quite align, a panel that looked just different enough to matter. It took effort to pry it open, her hands still not as strong as they once were. But when it finally gave way, revealing a narrow compartment hidden behind the wall, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: anticipation. Inside was a metal box, sealed but not locked, and when she opened it, the contents were far from what she expected. No cash, no jewelry, nothing immediately valuable, just documents, carefully wrapped and preserved, bearing her mother's name, official seals, and dates that went back decades. Margaret carried the box to the office, sat down slowly, and began to read, her eyes moving carefully over each page, piecing together something her mother had never fully explained in life. The cannery wasn't just a building. It came with rights, legal, binding rights tied to the coastline it sat on, agreements that had been signed years ago when the area had first been considered for commercial use, then forgotten when plans fell through and the town began to decline. But now, according to the documents in her hands, those plans had been revived, quietly approved again in recent months, turning what had once been overlooked land into something suddenly, significantly valuable. Processing rights, dock access, exclusive use clauses that meant anyone wanting to develop that stretch of coast would have to go through the cannery's owner, through her. Margaret sat there for a long time after finishing the last page, the weight of it settling in slowly, not as excitement, not even as relief, but as something deeper, a realization that while her sons had taken everything they could see, everything they could measure and sell and divide, they had completely missed the one thing that mattered most, because it had never been obvious, never been easy, never been something they cared enough to look for. And as if the world had been waiting for her to understand this before moving forward, things began to change quickly after that. Calls started coming in. First from local contacts who had heard whispers of redevelopment, then from investors, developers, people who spoke in numbers and projections, offering sums that would have once felt unimaginable to Margaret. all suddenly interested in a place they had ignored for years. And then, inevitably, came the knock she knew would follow. Her sons didn't call first. They showed up. Together. Standing outside the cannery like strangers who weren't quite sure how they would be received, their confidence tempered by uncertainty, because somewhere along the way, they had realized something had changed, and they were no longer in control of the outcome. Margaret saw them before they saw her, stepping out from the office slowly, wiping her hands on a cloth, her posture straighter than either of them remembered, her presence quieter but somehow stronger, and for a moment, none of them spoke, because everything that needed to be understood was already there in the space between them. They tried. Of course, they spoke about concern, about how they hadn't known, about how things had moved too quickly back then, about how they were only trying to do what they thought was best, and then, more carefully, about the cannery, about its potential, about how maybe they could work together moving forward, as a family. Margaret listened to every word without interrupting, her expression unreadable, not cold, not angry, just clear. And when they finally finished, when the explanations ran out and all that remained was expectation, she asked them one simple question, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "Did you think I wasn't coming back?" The silence that followed was longer this time, heavier, because there was no way to answer it without admitting the truth they had been avoiding, even from themselves. They had made their decision when she couldn't speak. They had ended her chapter before it was finished. And now they were standing in front of the part of her story they had never even known existed. Margaret let the silence sit for a moment longer before reaching into the folder she had brought with her, pulling out copies of the documents, the ownership papers, the rights that now carried more weight than anything they had taken from her, and handing them over without ceremony. Daniel took them first, his eyes scanning quickly, confusion giving way to realization, while Craig leaned in, his expression shifting in the same direction, both of them understanding at the same time what this meant, not just in value, but in consequence. When they looked back up at her, there was something different in their faces now, something uncertain, something almost hopeful, as if they still believed there was a version of this where they could be included, where their earlier decisions could be softened, rewritten. But Margaret didn't leave room for that. "I lost my home," she said quietly, not with bitterness, but with clarity. "But I didn't lose my judgment." And that was all she needed to say, because what followed wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, wasn't anything like the kind of confrontation people expect when wrongs are revealed. It was something far simpler and far more final. She didn't offer them a share, didn't invite them into the business, didn't suggest they could fix what they had done. What she gave them instead was distance, the same distance they had placed between her and her own life when she needed them most. Years later, the cannery became more than just a place that had been saved. It became a foundation for something new, a small but steady center of work and community that brought people back to the town, not all at once, but enough to matter, and Margaret remained at the center of it, not as someone who had been rescued, but as someone who had rebuilt, piece by piece, choice by choice, proving in the quietest way possible that losing everything doesn't end your story. It reveals what was always yours to begin with.